Hi. The COVID-19 virus has disrupted and rearranged the workplace with breathtaking speed. And in just the space of a couple of weeks, organisations across every sector have sent millions of employees home to work remotely. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time just to share some ideas around supporting our teams whilst we're all working remotely. It's without warning and in many cases without preparation of any kind. Managers and leaders have been thrust into positions of having to run their virtual teams. And quite often this is done for many for the first time. And I guess it's challenging enough for managers to manage themselves in quarantine without face-to-face human interaction. So this is something we're trying to get used to, and we've lost a bit of structure of the typical working day. Now, add to that the task of managing a team under those conditions, especially when you've never done it before, and this is pretty daunting. Just by way of introduction, my name's Tim Anderson. I'm an executive coach, and I've been coaching now for about 10 years. My background was 30 years in sales as a salesperson, sales manager, and sales director. And I've exited from two IT businesses over a period of time. And about 10 years ago, I set up as a business coach, an executive coach, and about a year and a half ago joined Know You More. Now, I mention this because my skill as a salesperson has been to work closely with both customers and with my sales teams in being able to help them communicate. The art of great sales is great communication. And I also think the art of great management is based and founded on excellent communication. So this presentation and this support is really about communication skills and providing them in these crazy and turbulent times. And in particular, how we need to consider how we meet people where they are, particularly when we're communicating online and in this digital environment. And I guess the first thing to consider when we're communicating digitally is that actually we're only using two of our five senses. We're obviously using sight and our ability to listen, but we've lost those senses of touch, feel, and taste, which are actually described as the social senses. So there needs to be some consideration when we're supporting our teams remotely, that we need to be able to find ways of compensating for the social senses that we're not able to deploy. But in saying that, what I'd like to concentrate on in this presentation is giving you some ideas and tips of how we might create the right conditions to meet the people we're talking to where they are. And I'll explain what I mean by this as we go through the presentation. So to do this, I'd like to take a quick dive into neuroscience. And it's interesting because whilst we've got this incredibly complex item stuck in our skull called the brain, it actually has one main function, and that's to keep us alive. And it does that in two ways. One, by continually asking, am I safe? And once the brain knows it's safe, the second subsection of that activity is, can I thrive? So the two main functions of the brain is one, am I safe? Am I okay to sit down, eat, and get nourished? Can I thrive? And if you fast forward that from perhaps the example of a caveman walking around in loinskins, making sure they're safe before they sit down and feed and nourish themselves. In a modern office environment where we've been sitting perhaps comfortably up until the turn of this year, that would mean in an office space. Okay, I'm safe. I've got my peers around me. I'm functioning well. I've got the support of my manager. Now, how can I enter into conversations and relationships where, as an individual, I can start thriving? And as we take an even deeper dive into neuroscience, I'd like to reference some work done by the late Judith Glaser and her fantastic book, Conversational Intelligence. If you ever get the chance to read this, it puts an amazing slant on how the brain is working when we're communicating. But she's talking about over here the information entering the brain, going through the amygdala, and then our limbic brain, which is where our emotional centers perform their activity, decides where to place a response to the information we're receiving. And she quite simply says it goes into one of two places. Either the prefrontal cortex, which is also referred to as the executive brain, or down here into the primitive brain or the reptilian brain. And there are two different sets of chemicals that are reacting within our brain at the time we see this information. Essentially, what's happening here is the information comes into the brain, and if it comes into the reptilian part of the brain, what's created are things like cortisol, testosterone, and these are quite natural things to be produced if we're in this part of the brain. What we're doing is creating the environment of the fight, flight, or freeze scenario, and that's when we need these things like cortisol and testosterone to kick in to help us perform. They're not necessarily the conditions that help create fantastic conversations. What happens if we can create trust and create the right environment is that the information that their brain's receiving is going into the prefrontal cortex, or the executive brain as it's referred to. And here the chemicals that are produced are oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin. These are the warm feelings that we get when our parents perhaps say we've done well, when our loved ones, our sons, daughters come up to us and give us a hug or a smile. These are the chemicals that are created. And it's in that environment where we best engage with our colleagues in a work environment where we can get open conversations and transformative conversations, as Judith Glaser describes in her book. There, just to take a pause, is the responsibility to create the right conditions when we're talking to our colleagues and peers. So what's this then got to do with how we then may take this forward and consider the relationships and the conversations that we're having with our colleagues whilst we're working remotely? So I now want to go on to the second stage of this and think about this in terms of our dear old friend Maslow. Most of you will be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the concept of we need to go through different levels of this pyramid, and until we've achieved or attained satisfaction at one level, before we can progress to the next. And if you think about this in terms of where we are in our really comfortable lives up until January, February of this year, where we're interacting with our peers and our colleagues in a work-based situation, we've been really operating in the esteem and self-actualization part of the pyramid. So if we think about the conversations and interactions we have, certainly at the esteem and self-actualization area, or level rather, they'll be about promotions, they'll be about performance, they'll be about pay reviews, they'll be about performance reviews, they'll be about how we can help and support our teams develop as individuals. We may throw in training and development. We may look at stretch projects. All of these things are levels of conversations that we have regularly been used to with our teams, and also there have been the levels where we regularly interact both at a social and at a business point, from a business point of view. But I just want you to pause and think for a moment with this absolutely devastating virus taking us way away from our normal circumstance. When you're meeting with your clients now, when you're meeting with your staff, where do you think they now sit on this hierarchy, on this pyramid? They're certainly removed down from self-actualization and esteem, and probably have come down into something like safety, looking for security. Maybe they're concerned about employment, how they're going to pay the mortgage, how they're going to pay the bills. And so if they've come down the levels of the pyramid and are in this sort of safety mode, I wonder what we do as leaders and as managers now when we connect with our teams to acknowledge and agree that that's actually where the conversations are now taking place, rather than before where they were up at the esteem and self-actualization level. So I think it's important as we approach our digital interactions to consider not a one-size-fits-all communication process, but a one-to-one communication process where we sit down, learn, listen, and understand where our individual team members sit, and maybe start the conversations at that spot. Maybe helping use some of the Judith Glaser ideas of the neuroscience that's going on, and be able to help meet our clients and our staff where they sit at the moment. So let's take a pause from that for a moment, because I want to take just a short time to consider the reaction and how people might be feeling now they've come down from self-actualization and esteem into safety. And why is this important? Well, there is going to be an element of frustration because this has happened so rapidly. And if suddenly we're diving down into the safety level, we will still be considering and expecting perhaps to be able to continue certain aspects of our life in esteem and self-actualization. There could be a high level of frustration where we're getting dragged back into this area of making sure we're secure and safe, and that being at the forefront of our mind is a natural thing. But in the back of our mind, there's also this, well, what's happening to the great things that I was doing, the projects, the opportunities, particularly maybe if you've just taken a big leap and a change and you're looking forward to maybe starting a new business, a new career, and you just made that move and suddenly you're pulled back into the security element. Sure, that'll be at the forefront of your mind, but there'll be a real frustration building up about not being able to actually get into this esteem and self-actualization level that you've been used to operating within. Another theory, and this is the theory of Carl Jung, which was the founding thoughts of an idea that was the basis of the Myers-Briggs, the MBTI personality or trait assessments. And what Carl Jung's theory was about creating a balance. And he talked about how we perceive things, how we take them in, and how we use this information in our decision making. And one of the first elements of the MBTI framework is that of where we get our energy from. And this was divided into two types of personality, two types of traits, being extroversion and introversion. Now, these weren't described in terms of the social context of those words, but from the point of view of actually, as an extrovert, we get our energy from external factors, by meeting with people, by being with people, perhaps get an energy from standing up and training or being a salesperson. So we get our energy from interacting with others, as opposed to perhaps the introverts, the introversion type is where people get their energy from internal perspective, from reflection, by being able to think about things, being able to have some time on their own to be able to gather energy. Now, this becomes important because if we can continue from time to time to operate in a practice and in a style where we are still retaining and getting energy, this is going to be a good thing for when we're then diving back into the safety element of the Maslow's hierarchy. However, if we're trying to operate in areas where we don't gain energy, all that's going to be is actually a drain on our resources and a drain on our energy. So perhaps we need to be able to consider, when we're conversing with our teams and our clients, how we can help them support some sort of activity in order to be able to gain energy. So coming back to our Maslow's structure, Maslow's pyramid, is it possible that, firstly, meeting these people at safety, then considering and diving in from time to time into esteem and self-actualization, is it possible that we can create the space to help them do so? I know that a lot of the coaching conversations I've had recently have led to people feeling almost guilty of diving into these top two levels. There's been almost a reluctance that actually, when they're at home thinking about whether they can pay the bills, thinking of how they interact with the children who are also perhaps at home and self-schooling, how they can balance all these things but still give them time and energy and opportunity to work at the esteem and self-actualization levels. So I wonder, as leaders, as managers, whether or not part of our role when we're communicating with our teams is to be able to give them that space, give them that opportunity where they don't feel guilty, but where they can remove some of the frustration of not being able to operate at that level by giving them permission to. This could take the form of giving them some projects or some training, setting up some e-learning modules for them to be able to at least spend a little bit of time whilst they're working remotely into also doing something for themselves, giving them some opportunities to indulge a little without feeling guilty. And I think this is probably a great gift to be able to give people in this time. Reached out and said, look, how do I interact with my team? How do I show empathy? How do I show that I care? And the conversation got into the topic of him perhaps sending a hamper. And I asked for permission to give feedback and shared with him that I felt that that was almost condescending because what it was beginning to do is put a monetary value, what's the value of these hampers perhaps that he's going to send round, or food parcels. What's the difference between a food parcel coming from a food bank to one coming from Aldi or Waitrose or Harrods? It's just the price factor. And actually, would he not be showing more empathy, more understanding by being able to, rather than spend money on a food hamper, put it onto some sort of level of training or support that might be able to demonstrate, one, the understanding, but also give permission to his member of his teams that they could self-indulge, that they could continue to have some sort of self-actualization or development, as well as having to be concerned about security and the like. So, in conclusion to my ramblings, perhaps, how can you help support your team? Well, when dealing with our teams and our coaches, we need to understand where they sit in terms of Maslow's pyramid. We need to create the conditions for great conversations and perhaps meet them where they are. We need to help them understand it's okay to spend some time in esteem and self-actualization. And if we're in a position to provide them with support and resources to help them continue to develop in these difficult times. And a final thought, perhaps you need to consider your own position on the pyramid, which will in turn help you turn up as the leader that you aspire to be. I hope you found that useful, and should you have any queries or comments, I'd be delighted to hear from you and discuss this topic further. Thank you for listening.